Hi, everyone. Hi, Jason.
Hey, Xenia.
Welcome back to Disasters Deconstructed live stream. We're doing a triple act today. Join us, JC Gaia. Hi, JC.
Hello. Nice to be here. Nice to be joining the rock band for one night, one morning for me.
Yeah, early morning. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining our special live stream episode. Today, we will be talking about the Power, Prestige, and Forgotten Value Manifesto. And in particular, we will be focusing on perspectives on the opportunities and challenges that we researchers and also disaster practitioners kind of need to reflect upon when we do post-disaster research. And Jason has just provided a link to the manifesto. So if you haven't seen this yet, please check it out. JC will talk about it a little bit more in a second. If you've seen our live streams before, the rules are the same. We will have some amazing panelists, and I will introduce those shortly. But also, if you have any questions, please post this online on social media, whether you're watching this on YouTube, on Facebook, on Twitter. Please retweet the live event as you're watching it, and we would love to hear from you. All right. So over to you, Jason.
Okay, so one of the discussions that was born out of our reflections on the manifesto, maybe some of you have been following the podcast, and it's something that comes up quite often. We had some special episodes, and I think a lot of our guests refer back to it, and it's been kind of something that a lot of us have been chewing on for the past few years, right? So, but one of the things that has come out of that is deeper reflection on how we do research. And some of the work that JC and Laurie have been doing has been around sort of discussing ethics in research and an ethical code of conduct. And so in their piece published in Nature, I know a lot of you will be aware of that piece. JC and Laurie write that disaster zone research needs a code of conduct because if we're to study the effects of hazards, then it needs to be done with sensitivity to ethical dilemmas and power imbalances. And of course, there are so many practices around the world that we need to reflect on, but this is something I think that's really important that we do today, and we brought together some amazing voices to do just that. Do you want to tell us a bit about the idea of a code of conduct or an accord, JC?
Yes, sure, Jason. So first and foremost, thanks for having me and for dedicating some time to this important topic, which I think deserves your attention. So yes, you said Laurie and I had the privilege to write this short piece for Nature a couple of years ago. It was written a couple of years ago, yeah, a bit more. And I think it was reflecting a sort of growing concern that the two of us, but many more people we know around us, have been feeling about how we conduct research immediately following disasters. And I guess the point, and Laurie is going to correct me afterwards if I misinterpret her intentions, but from my perspective, there were four issues or four questions that we wanted to raise in view of eventually getting people to think about a potential code of conduct or accord or whatever we call it. And I think these issues revolve around four key questions. The first one is the what we research following disasters, and the so-called idea of perishable data, and whether there's actually something that needs to be researched immediately after disaster, because otherwise we would miss out on something important that may inform the practice of recovery and disaster risk reduction in the long term. That was the first question. The second one is the why we're doing this. And I guess all of us in this field are driven by a genuine goodwill. No question about this. But whether this goodwill actually reflects the concerns and the priorities of those who have been affected by the disaster is another question. And that's something that we need to think about, I guess. The third is how we do the research following disasters, and that's one of my main concerns at the moment. How from a methodological perspective, but the how as well from a broader epistemological and ontological perspective. Whether the concepts we use, whether the frameworks we use to understand what's happening following disasters actually reflects how people view the world, especially beyond the West. This is something we need to put more attention on, for sure, from my perspective. And the fourth one, that probably explains most of the three previous points, is who actually researches following disasters. And if the first 3 points have been an issue for us, all of us, is because I personally believe, at least, that post-disaster research, and I would say almost disaster studies at large, are skewed towards researchers based in, let's call them Western countries. And that at the same time, most of the disasters occurring in the world, and we can debate what a disaster means, and there's an issue around that, but most of the disasters tend to occur beyond the West. So there's a sort of dichotomy and paradox there that explains why we're using Western epistemologies and ontologies in researching disasters, why our priorities may not be those of those affected, and why the what we research may actually not be the top priorities for the local places where disasters occur. So I think these are the 4 key questions and key motivations for writing this paper. And I think it's been, to some extent, overwhelmingly well received. I think both Laurie and I have received a lot of support afterwards. The limited amount of criticisms or challenges that we've faced, I think, stem from misunderstandings, and I think this is why I very much like the idea of having this event today and more around the manifesto at large. Misinterpreted or misunderstood in the sense that some people have thought that we were arguing for a rigid list of strict guidelines or strict do's and don'ts to be endorsed by the UN, because we mentioned the UN and UNDRR at the end of the paper. And this was absolutely not our intention, and I'm pretty sure Laurie will agree with me on this. Our intention was to raise the issues and to have this kind of code of conduct or accord. I'm moving away from code of conduct myself because I think it may look too rigid. But it's to make sure that we have some sort of ethical principles that are grounded. So nothing that would look like a universal set of bullet points that would apply everywhere in the world. That's the opposite. So we're arguing for some loose principles that would fit the local context and that would not be endorsed by any institution or co-opted by any institution. And that's why we were kind of suggesting to have a sort of neutral place, which could be a UN event, but not to be endorsed by the UN. A neutral place for the document, whatever it is in the end, not be co-opted by one particular organization or one particular set of people. But I'm sure Laurie will talk more about this afterwards. So that's all for me, I think, for a 5 a.m. Intro. Over to you two, Jason.
Thank you so much, JC. That is pretty amazing for 5 a.m. So, but yeah, thank you so much for the introduction. Um, and well, as already Jason mentioned, we have a really amazing and truly global panel with us today. We've got Laurie Peak, Mihir Bhatt, Terry Gibson, Jalali Benoir, and hopefully Sarah Bevan. I think the technology has allowed us, the connection has allowed us to connect Sarah. And special thanks from me here for staying up really, really late, and to Sarah and JC for getting up really, really early. But this is what happens when we've got global engagement. So thank you all so much. So we have asked our guests to reflect on the opportunities and challenges associated with research following disasters in the context within which they work. And they all work in very different contexts in terms of disciplines, but also geographically. And our first speaker today is Mihir Bhatt. Many of you will know Mihir's work, and he joined us on the podcast in season 3, I think. So Mihir's contributions are really, really well known in disaster risk reduction. Mihir works with All India Disaster Mitigation Institute and has conducted action research during and after some of the defining disasters, such as Gujarat 2001 earthquake, in India, 2004 tsunami in Indian Ocean, and many more. Mihir, welcome. It's great to have you here, and over to you. You're muted, I think. We can't hear you. Yeah.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I really appreciate it. It's a very important topic that you've brought to us. Post-disaster research, reflecting on challenges and opportunities. And let me share some of my reflections on this topic as they emerge in my mind from my work on action and learning on a post-disaster research work. First, what is post-disaster, or how and when disasters end? And this is an area that has haunted me again and again since 2001 Gujarat earthquake recovery, follow-up, and also to my team. We are still doing, till to date, what has happened post-Gujarat 2001 earthquake. As technology, social context, political processes, economy changes at an accelerated rate, it becomes even more important to come to terms with this rapidly changing that what is post-disaster. And I think in 2001, it meant one thing. Now, 2021, it means something else. So that's something I'd like to do more work on, what is post-disaster and how it is defined. The second thing is on how we do research. And I think there has been, as far as methodology is concerned, too much focus, recently even more on evidence and data science, and both are important and we all benefit from that. But I think there is a need to look at reflection as a centerpiece of research, and both by the researcher and what is being researched and who's being researched. And this is something in terms of how we do research, I'd like to underline, and we can have questions on that subsequently. The third is the what part, and is this separation of the challenges from opportunities a useful way to move ahead? Challenges and opportunities. Maybe we shouldn't separate the two. Is it not more useful to think of challenges as opportunities and locate our post-disaster research there as a starting point? Will it help to us as researchers, and more importantly to them, the victims, if we locate not either in challenges or opportunities, but challenges as opportunities? Having raised the above three somewhat overarching concern, I'd like to come to something else, and that is again the what part of post-disaster research. And I've said it several times, that this neoliberal economics offers desired results or opportunities, but I don't think it will offer any more in the coming years, maximum a decade. What's going to happen is that the rate at which the development will produce risk would become far higher than the rate at which the risk is being reduced, and that gap keeps on increasing. So what would be useful to do in terms of post-disaster research, from my point of view, is to see what are the limits of this neoliberal economics within which disaster-related actions and learning that is taking place. Is there a way out? Maybe the feminist economics, maybe circular economics, maybe economy of nurturance and that idea. I don't know, but we need to look at post-disaster recovery, post-disaster research in that line. Two of the reasons we need to research more, and we don't know enough as far as post-disaster is concerned, is what is called co-location of disasters, and they're happening more and more. And how do we actually do the post-disaster research when they are co-located, when they are cascading, when they are extreme, they are radically different than they have been before. So that is an area where a lot of post-disaster research, I think, would be very useful. Again, what question? And that is related to how adapting to climate change in post-disaster period is becoming more important. There are new disasters such as heat wave, and we hardly know what happens post-heat wave in terms of 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. We know that disasters behave differently, such as the cyclones on India. 1 week, both coasts, we had cyclone, which has not happened before, hardly ever. Again, what question? And panel studies after post-disaster are very important, and not much is done on that. We've started some in Kerala after 2018 floods, but not only panel studies in terms of quantitative and hopefully qualitative data collection, but post-disaster studies by the victims themselves, panel study looking at what has happened to themselves and giving a scorecard to their performance in terms of achievements and what has not been achieved. That would be an area. And one more is our need to look at post-disaster research in terms of visions and promises of what I may call mystical tradition of recovery, and that is overdue. Sort of what's a Asian vision of post-disaster, African promise post-disaster, what is minority vision in various countries, north or south, and how do they see recovery in India, for example, Dalits and minority religious groups and ethnic groups. Migrants, not a minority in many sense, but still. So what is their vision? And that's the area which would be very useful to research. And last, and I'd like to end there, is when will we start looking at the spiritual, philosophical aspect of post-disaster life? And I know we are talking about food and water, and that's something very important to shelter, settlement planning, infrastructure. But still, life is not full if things beyond that are not looked at. And I'm not referring to religion or faith only, but what is around and beyond that. And that's something which is very important to people who are affected by disasters, but also researchers such as us to see how that is taking place. So these are the areas in terms of opportunities and challenges both combined, I see would be very useful. Thank you very much for this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mi. Always fantastic to listen to your insights and practitioners' perspectives on these issues. I mean, I'm always amazed by your ability to pull things together in such a short period of time. So thank you so very much for that. Now we'll move to our next guest, who is my partner in crime somehow, inviting this short piece for Nature a couple of years ago. So Professor Laurie Pick, so she's a professor of sociology and the director of the Natural Hazard Center at the University of Colorado Boulder. And Laurie leads this large National Science Foundation funded initiative in the US called Converge, and which is trying to coordinate or develop some sort of ethical guidelines and practices around disaster research at large. And it's been an amazing experience to kind of watch that from the outside, my side of the world. Yeah, over to you, Laurie. Looking forward to listening to your thoughts on these issues.
Thank you, JC, and just an enormous thanks to you and to Ksenia and Jason for convening this conversation. And Mahir, I just wanted to follow up from you saying that 2001 was also a year that I was going to begin my remarks with. And I know it was the year of the Gujarat earthquake, and it was also the year of the 9/11 attacks here in the US, which was actually my first experience with doing field research, and has been followed by many, many more opportunities to travel to the field and to learn from disaster affected persons. And it's hard to believe that it's been 20 years. And I am so glad that 20 years on that we're having this conversation, and conversations like this are being held around the world, because this is crucially important that as researchers that we never lose sight of the heart of disasters and what disasters do in terms of upending lives, the trauma that they can cause, the social solidarity that they can generate. And disasters reveal the social world in all of its complexity. And I am just so honored to be a part of this panel and to have an opportunity to talk about our approaches as researchers in the post-disaster timeframe. And so Ksenia and Jason have put us on a strict time frame. I have about 6 minutes remaining, and in those 6 minutes, they've asked that we cover 3 big challenges and 3 big opportunities, as you just heard Mahir do so eloquently. And so I'm going to start with what I see as 3 major challenges that we are currently confronting in our research field. And so number 1 has to do with the number of disasters, the sheer number of compound, complex, and cascading disasters that are occurring around the world, and that now upend tens of millions of lives every single year. The sheer number of the disasters that we are confronting in this ever more turbulent world has challenged our research community, and I would argue has stretched many researchers, many research teams, centers, and institutes to the limit in terms of resources that are available and our capacity to study these disasters. And so that's one big challenge. Second big challenge is related to what disasters we are able to study, given the resource and capacity and simple time limitations among what I think is a small but incredibly mighty research community. And so the second big challenge is we know that the disasters that we tend to study tend to be high impact, high attention, and in high income countries. And that is something that JC touched on in his opening remarks about the where did these studies take place. And so a little bit of data that I wanted to share with listeners today, and I'm going to talk more about this in a moment, but I am very privileged to lead through the Converge Network. I'm the leader of the Social Science Extreme Events Research Network, which now includes over 1,200 researchers from around the world. And one of the questions we ask researchers when they join SCEAR is about what specific disaster events have you studied? And our analysis of that data found that researchers in the network have studied 1,166 discrete events or named disaster events. Here are the top 10 most studied events: Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Harvey, Hurricane Maria, Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Irma, the 9/11 terrorist attacks, the Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami, the Fukushima Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami, COVID-19, and the BP Horizon oil spill. And so while SSEER is not yet representative of all researchers globally, and we know that there are more SSEER researchers from the United States than any other country, which is undoubtedly shaping this list, but it does tell us something about, again, where are researchers focusing their attention. And what that means is that low impact, low attention disasters, oftentimes in low income countries, may not be getting the focus and attention and the research that is needed and deserved. So second big challenge. Third big challenge has to do with the size and composition of our research community. I simply do not think that we have the number of researchers, the diversity of researchers, and researchers who are fully capacitated in the places that are most at risk in this world. And given the ever more turbulent world that we live in and the extreme 21st century challenges that we are facing, I think growing the research community and ensuring that we are prepared to be thinking across systems and structures is one of the greatest challenges, but also opportunities of our time. And so that leads me to my three final points in relation to Jason and Ksenia's question about what are three opportunities that might lead us forth in response to these challenges. And so first, major opportunity, I think, has to do with what is going on with the movements for global justice that have swept countries around the world. Here I'm talking about movements for Black Lives Matter, for various human rights, for democracy. And I think this is a moment where justice and ethics are at the fore in terms of much broader conversations, obviously, that are far outside of our field. And so I think this is such an opportunity for us as a field, as we are thinking about our research agendas and our forward movement, to also be thinking about justice and equity and putting justice, equity, and ethics on a common plane with our research agenda. So we are constantly thinking about these issues simultaneously. This is what I've been referring to as the opportunity for just reconnaissance. Second big opportunity. We now have, as JC mentioned, in the United States, thanks to the funding of the National Science Foundation, coordinating networks that have never existed before. We have extreme events research coordinating networks for the social sciences, earth sciences, and engineering that has brought together research communities in previously unforetold ways. And so with the Extreme Events Research Networks, as well as with the Converge facility, we've been able to develop trainings and ethical, that center ethics as well as research findings. We've been able to bring researchers together, such as after COVID-19, in order to get organized and to move forward with questions of crucial importance. But I think we need Converge funding in countries around the world to ensure that this sort of research coordination is occurring in all of the world's major regions, and we are mobilizing researchers, ensuring they have access to training and resources. And third and final big opportunity that I foresee is that as we develop our coordinating networks, as we identify where researchers are and literally put them on the map, as we've been doing through the SSEER network, I think this is an opportunity like never before for us to come together as a community and to co-construct our ethical principles. As JC said, we're never going to have one singular code of conduct that is going to work across all time, places, and disciplines. But I think this is a moment to start this conversation about ethics. And with that, I know I'm at my time. Thank you for giving me the time, and I cannot wait to learn from the rest of this panel. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Lori. Thank you for sharing your time today and these beautiful thoughts. And I'm sure our audience will have some questions for you and the other panelists. And And if anybody's tuning in and just wondering about how to get engaged, just post your comments wherever you are, whatever platform you're listening on. I'm trying to put in some prompts on the screen as well to encourage this, but we would love to hear questions as well. So thanks, Laurie. I'm going to move on now and introduce our next guest. So we're very happy to have with us Jalali Benoir, who is a professor of earthquake engineering and disaster risk management at the Faculty of Civil Engineering and director of research at the Faculty of Civil Engineering as well at the University of Science and Technology. I'm messing it up. Sorry, Jalali. Boumediene in Alger. He's a founding member of the Algerian Academy of Sciences and Technologies and has been a member of the Integrated Research on Disaster Risk Science Committee and a member of the Algerian Hazards Network and coordinator of the PERI-U. So Jalali, thanks so much for joining us, and I'll hand it over to you now for your thoughts on this topic.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. I'm very honored to be able to speak as an engineer, of course. I'm not a social scientist, I'm just an engineer working, with the hard technology on this matter. First of all, I'd like to say that this matter of learning from the past, but how far we should go from the past, as disasters were taken before as an event. Now we are understanding that disasters are not an event. This is a process which maybe has been, which has started maybe, like 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Because when you study and you go back in time, you see all these chains, all the conditions, all the factors, they have contributed to the event. If we understand that the disaster research or past disaster research will be easier to understand what is a disaster. Now, the first priority of Sendai is understanding risk, where you take risk as a vulnerability and the hazard. But I believe this here is to understand the disaster itself, deconstruct the disaster. And that is better to understand and to learn the lessons. If we take the disaster as a process, we have to go back in time as much as possible. It's not the engineering when you see building collapse, not the engineering. Sometimes you go to legislation, sometimes you go to institutions, you go to administration, you go to, of course, you go to men, to humans, because at the end of the day, after the research, you will see that humans are the main cause of the disaster. With this, you have to go really not to the causes, but to root causes of the disaster, and it will help us for disaster risk reduction and disaster risk management. Now, if I talk about ethics in engineering, which is the moral decision. It's a moral decision that must be made by engineers in the course of engineering practice. In engineering practice for new buildings or like past disaster. What we do really in engineering in engineering aspects, and quickly after the disaster, because before the damage are done, by the government or something, is to take samples of the damage, samples of everything, of the building itself, thinking about the soil, thinking about the occupants. All these we have to take them and try to simulate the damage. Going to take these samples as much as possible, going back to the labs and use science and technology, pure science and technology, try to simulate the damage. If we really achieve that, then we know somehow the causes. What are the causes? Maybe the causes are not engineering. Maybe the cause is the administration, because of the site they have selected to implement the building is not good, and it is written and it is said by scientists. But these days, people, especially politicians, they don't believe too much on science, and that's our big problem today. And then afterwards, they call the scientists. It's too late to call us after that. Then what we try to do is but the difficulty we still have, it's not the physical phenomena. This can be studied, but the combination of the physical phenomena and the vulnerability of the exposure, whatever it is, humans, populations, buildings, and that's with the soil, of course, and that's make things a little bit complex, because all these soil and buildings and people and infrastructure where there is now connectivity and interconnectivity, and we should take into account all these connectivities, dependencies, or all this infrastructure, especially in urban sites, which make the urban sites like a complex system, which has to be solved as a whole. Looking back in time, and this is like a puzzle, trying to put the pieces together to have the full picture of what happened, and this will help us to learn the lessons, draw conclusions, and of course do recommendation for a code, not a code of conduct, because this is more moral than like a code of construction, which is strict, and this is what we should do. Now for this, of course, the main problem with scientists today is that the people, they don't respect if we call it the code of conduct or just engineering ethics or ethics. Because if you don't respect ethics, you may do whatever you want with the data. You play with the data, you calibrate your model as you want, and you find the good results. Somebody else like them. Maybe not you, maybe a politician will like them. That's why ethics in engineering or any other research, especially in disaster deconstruction, this is very important to talk about ethics and try to sensitize or raise awareness of people doing that they should be honest to respect the moral decision you will take, because your decision will maybe cause harm to some other people because of money or because you're going to please somebody. Then it's important for the engineers to stick to the professional code, first of all, because we have professional codes, but not everybody would accept it and adhere to it. We should stay legal. We should be honest. This is very important, because people play with the data and with the model, with the calibration, even with the validation to say this is, and they draw conclusion and recommendation, and the disaster will continue. And of course, we need to have the relevant information before we draw conclusions. This is very important, and have integrity. Integrity is also very, very important. Be responsible, because we are professionals. At a certain age, we are not students anymore. We don't like to play with that. We have to be responsible, because our decision may kill people. And also, we should tell the truth. This is what we should teach people: telling the truth. This is a great value. Give credit to where credit is due. This is also a quality for humans. Do no harm. Do no harm, because you are playing with these models and data. And because you should benefit the others. Benefit the other, whatever be just. This is also a quality of a human. This is like, and also there is, I would say, I don't have time to go further, but moral is everything, like moral awareness, moral reasoning, moral consistency, moral imagination, moral communication, moral respect to persons, tolerance and diversity. Tolerance and diversity. Your decisions should not depend on the religion or culture or everything. More hope and integrity. And this is the what I would like to say for today. I cannot go further in the engineering practice, but this is what I can. So if I have some question, I will try to answer. And thank you very much again for inviting me to this panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jalali. And it really warms my heart to hear you and engineers more in general talking about people, ethics, and most importantly, honesty. These conversations were not really salient before, but I think they're just so important to everything that we do. I'm so happy to see the shift from engineering being seen just as I kind of come and build shelter, right, to something that is actually morally and ethically important to everything that we do. So thank you so much for your contribution. And indeed, to our audience, if you have any questions, please post them wherever you're watching this, and we will have opportunity to ask this questions to our panelists later on. And now it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Sarah Bevan. Hi, Sarah. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Ksenia. It's
Hi.
Such an honor to be part of this panel, and
Thank you.
to follow such inspiring speeches is a huge
Thank
privilege.
you. Thank you so much, and thank you for waking up so early as well. And I'm glad the technology worked out. So Sarah Bevan is senior lecturer in disaster risk and resilience in the School of Earth and Environment at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand. Sarah's research focuses on the use of formal governance arrangements to manage the institutional misalignments that can make it very difficult for scientists to engage productively with the wider cross-sector coordination efforts that are required to reduce disaster risks, but also to respond and to recover from disasters. So, Sarah, we look forward to hear your reflection today.
Thank you, Ksenia. I think I've organized mine into 3 opportunities and 3 risks. And I think the opportunities, I'll start with the opportunities because I think they do address to some extent the risks. So I think the first one is that as somebody who's particularly interested in the working across sector and disciplinary boundaries, disasters really require a sort of an innovative upsurge of coordination and collaboration. And they provide an opportunity for researchers to join in with that, and so to become part of that. And I think they're also particularly useful for someone like me who's interested in how those things work. And I think the third thing that's really important, and it sort of adds to something that Laurie was saying, is that people who are involved actually in disasters become very interested in this field often. And so it's a really good opportunity to build capacity. And I think I completely agree with her that it's critical to be building capacity in countries where it's much harder for researchers to become part of the global community. I think the risks that are posed by this really come down to the sorts of things that Laurie and JC have been talking about. But I think from my sort of perspective, I'm particularly interested in that larger picture. And so you do get in the post-disaster zone, and I think particularly in the sort of months and early years after a big event, you get that enormous kind of condensation of space, compression of space, because you get actor convergence into that area. And you also get a real compression of time, as Laurie Johnson and Rob Olshansky have demonstrated. And so those people who are in that area are really struggling in any case with these as kind of secondary impacts after the disaster. And I think I worry enormously that researchers can significantly make those worse. And I think that to me is one of the huge issues, and it's particularly an ethical issue from my point of view, because all researchers gain from gathering data. You know, the data they gather is of great value to them, and usually of more value to them than it is to those from whom the data has been gathered. And I think that includes, I was very, very moved by Jalali's speech as well, because in many cases you have a sequence of different scientists, including geosciences and engineers, as well as social scientists, will often all need to interact with the same people on their property or in their house, that sort of thing. And I think, to me, that there's a very high risk that that is going to significantly augment the secondary impacts on the populations. So, in fact, have the opposite effect than the one that we wish it to have. And the great problem with it is that it's such a large-scale effect. So it's not the fault of individual researchers or easily addressable by individual researchers. It's about how research is coordinated. And I think, to me, that it's particularly important to make sure that research after a disaster is coordinated in such a way that it provides maximum benefit to everyone trying to recover from the disaster, including communities, but also the agencies that are trying to work on the ground in the disaster area. And the best way to do that, in my opinion, is for everyone to be trying to work together. So I think, and also for research to be conducted so that it is of benefit to those in the post-disaster zone directly. Not in a more general way for the sort of rest of the world. I think to me, that's why taking part in the larger coordinated effort and building capacity, particularly locally, are the two really key things that researchers can try to do in a post-disaster zone. So the last thing I just would like to say is that whenever researchers are publishing based on data gathered in a disaster zone, it's really critical to co-author those publications with as many of the local researchers and actors as possible to try to help build that capacity and to provide them with some of the benefit and credit that you would normally get from publishing. That's really all I have to say. I'm hoping that I'm inside my time frame. Thank you very much again for the opportunity to present here today.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I mean, for those who don't know Sarah, she's always very low profile and modest, but she's been a huge source of inspiration for me, at least, and in thinking about all these issues. And I remember some conversations we had in Christchurch after the earthquake, and Sarah hasn't mentioned, but she's speaking from the perspective of someone who lives in Christchurch and who's experienced the series of earthquakes from within, and who's been researching from within, and who has developed such a thing as some sort of ethical guidelines for research on disasters in New Zealand. And yeah, I mean, this is amazing always to listen to your thoughts on these issues. So thank you so very much for being with us early this morning.
Yeah, it's great.
So now let's turn on to our next guest, Terry Gibson. Terry is a practitioner / writer / researcher / many other things, I guess. He's been working with networks of civil society organizations for years, decades. He used to be the key person driving the Views from the Frontline survey from the Global Network for Disaster Risk Reduction. I have to mention your book, Terry, Making Aid Agencies Work, because it's become a key reading for my postgraduate students. And for those who don't know Terry's book, published by Emerald a few years ago, I can't remember, 3-4 years ago, but it's really a very, very important book that practitioners and researchers conducting research in that broader space of disaster studies, humanitarian studies, conflict studies should read, because this is informed by practice and super insightful, really. So over to you, Terry. We're very keen to listen to your thoughts.
Thanks very much for those really kind words, Josie, and I'm really grateful to be part of this event, and I found it really insightful listening to the contributors. I hope I can add something in a small way. The focus of what I want to talk about is opportunities and challenges in action research among practitioners. I'm going to mainly talk about a particular case study of a small-scale piece of work we did together recently during the pandemic. And in order to talk about that, I want to mention some of the learning from previous work. JC mentioned views from the front line. And we also, about 3 years ago, with a group of 8 practitioners, took over an issue of the Journal of Disaster Prevention and Management, a special issue. So that was authored by a group of civil society organisation practitioners. And I want to talk first about the opportunities and challenges that we detected in doing those pieces of work. Opportunities, and one of the other speakers hinted at this, there are certainly output effects. Views from the Frontline produced reports which were intended to be almost sometimes very influential. But we talk about process effects as well. When we've gathered feedback, the participants in this work talk about the way that being involved in practitioner research gives them skills development, helps them build relationships, helps them to do network building, helps their learning. So it spins off to their own work. Also, in the nature of it, it focuses on contextualized, localized DRR. Many disasters are pretty small scale and they're very localized in nature. And that leads on to the quality of local experiential knowledge creation, which can be achieved by these programs of work and has been. So those are a few general opportunities, a few general challenges. First of all, the very basic one, mobilizing practitioners to research. They're activists, they're not researchers, they're very busy. They don't naturally reflect, they don't have time to even. And so it's difficult to mobilize practitioners to participate in knowledge co-creation. Linked to that, they're often being pressed to produce success stories to do with the funding loops they're tangled up in. That makes it difficult to be reflective, to think critically, to talk about failure. And the trouble is that failure is often where learning starts. And following on from that, trust. Practitioners are often individual, isolated, have little confidence that what they have to say will be striking to people. And so they can tend to be resistant to sharing in such work. Some ways we mitigated those challenges were focusing on time-constrained shared actions rather than just general chat. Something like Views from the Frontline or the journal issue, people could engage with something that was focused and had a clear output. And those projects needed to work in an iterative way. The first cut didn't get very far, and we sometimes went through a number of iterations as people gradually deconstructed what they were saying and learnt to think about it more deeply. Those are a couple of the mitigations, but I'm going to turn now to a piece of work we did between December of 2020 through to March or so of this year. And that was just that through the contacts we had, we said, what's going on at local level in terms of the pandemic? Because those voices and those experiences are often unheard. And so we circulated 25 of our contacts, local CSO practitioners, and started with a discussion paper, and then over 16 iterations of sending out messages and getting responses and aggregating them and sharing them back. About 18 of those 25 participated, and we gradually grew a discussion paper, turned it into a report, presented that at a webinar, and then turned that into reports and blogs which have been circulated regionally, nationally, and internationally, and that's ongoing. And a couple of things we found from that are again about the output and process thing. Clearly, I've mentioned the outputs there, but I got a lot of unrequested feedback talking about how much the participants valued the learning that they gained from the process, and also the sense of solidarity working together with their colleagues distributed across a couple of continents. But we found the same challenges, the challenge of mobilizing practitioners to research. The iterations help to nudge people who are busy and often reticent in putting themselves forward, and building trust. People taking the risk to share their thoughts. A very detailed practical thing is that we found that whereas we've often used forums and platforms of that sort, open groups, we found a much greater level of participation, ironically, through a centrally led and facilitated process where we sent out messages of mail mergers. So you got a Dear Terry message. And we found when we tried both approaches that people are much more comfortable with what they feel is personal and which doesn't necessarily expose them to everybody straight away. And so these are kind of nuances, as my colleague said, in how we can work in practitioner research. I'm going to give a couple of conclusions in terms of opportunities and challenges, and then I'll just read out the headlines of the findings that the group gathered in the work I've just described. And I think the link's been on the screen, so if you want to find out more about this stuff, you can find that at the link. So an opportunity, well, the opportunity in this particular piece and the earlier pieces I mentioned is that of local level knowledge creation through action research, as it foregrounds important local experience and knowledge, and at the same time has these process benefits of feeding back directly on the participants and benefiting them. And set against that the technical and social challenges, which are those of working often online, very rarely face-to-face with people who are isolated, don't necessarily feel comfortable with sharing their thinking, and are also very busy. So those are my kind of conclusions. I will just read out the headlines of the report they created. The things that they thought were things to be faced in their learning from involvement in COVID to date. Number 1, avoid creating disasters within the disaster. Number 2, tackle trade-offs between health and economics. Number 3, increase reliance on local capacities. Number 4, increase rather than decreasing local funding to support local capacities. Number 5, build partnership to strengthen coordinated responses. And number 6, adopt a long-term perspective. Those headings on their own may not make a lot of sense, but if you go to the background document, they're unpacked there. Thanks very much. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Terry. Right on time with your alarm. Amazing. Okay, so I'm going to bring everybody back on the screen now. We really appreciate everybody's contributions today. It's just been incredible to listen to. We're going to open up the discussion now with all of you. And I think we've had some prominent themes that have been coming to the surface here around ethical approaches to research, around how we collaborate, how we engage, how we cooperate, whose voices are centered. And something that I was thinking about, and I wonder if anyone has thoughts on this, is about who needs whom in this post-disaster research context. Do the people that we are claiming to help need us, or do we need them? That's something that was just on my mind as I listened and reflect on this issue. And I was just thinking about how recovery really needs to be grounded in the humanity of people affected by disasters, rather than on their humanitarian need, as we may frame it. And I think we do a lot of harm in the way that we frame people and label people. So I wonder if anyone wants to speak to that. That's some initial thoughts from me listening to all of your amazing contributions. Maybe Laurie and JC, I mean, maybe you could speak from the position that you were coming from on the work that you were doing on post-disaster ethics, and about just in response to kind of my thoughts there.
First, I just want to say, I mean, Jason, that's an incredible synthesis of some of the cross-cutting themes of these comments, and I think such a powerful question. Do they need us, or do we need them? And I think it really gets at what Sarah was saying as well. And I guess one tension, I'm going to pick up that question, but one tension that I also picked up in the discussion was sort of, and I think it is something that JC and I highlighted in the article about the research being beneficial and locally grounded and meaningful. But then something I've been grappling with is obviously at the heart of research is a question, and you don't know the answer to the question. That is why you are doing the research, at least with many forms of research. And so what if the answer to the question isn't of benefit, or in fact maybe of harm to the communities where we are studying, that might marginalize them, that might stigmatize them, and so forth. And so I think just being real and being honest about that tension of sort of when we're calling for research that is beneficial, that it's locally grounded, that it's meaningful to the people who've been most affected, but then also this recognition that research is messy and it's complicated, and we don't know the answer at the beginning if we're doing research. And so how do we reconcile that, and reconcile what I agree with what JC said at the beginning about what I think is a heart and a mind and a set of minds in this community that is focused on trying to do good and wanting to do good, but then there are real tensions that emerge in the process of this. So JC, I'll hop it over to you, because Jason, I mean, this is a really provocative and important question. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Laurie. I mean, I agree with all what you said, of course. I think to me, the next step is that everything comes down to what a disaster is in the first place, and what's a disaster in whose eyes. I'm arguing in an upcoming book towards the later part of the year that disaster is a Western invention anyway, and what we feel is a disaster may not be a disaster for the people we research, speech marks, and that's, to me, that's the bottom line issue, because if we don't agree upon what we are researching and whether what we're researching is actually something which is an issue, and whether we actually are researching what others may feel like is something like Western, then there's a mismatch in the first place, which means eventually having a mismatch of everything in terms of the methods, the epistemology, and who does what, and what we publish on, etc., etc. So I think, to me, it comes down to what a disaster is, and whether there's such a thing as a disaster in the first place. A concept we can't translate in most languages in the world anyway. And until we address this issue, then I think we can't get very far further in our journey in terms of understanding how we should do research post-disasters.
Thank you, JC. You know, I want to follow up on this with my next question. And of course, many of us, we have had this discussion in previous life. Oh, previous life? Oh, wow. In previous episodes. It's coming to the end of the working day here in the UK. So many of you have reflected on morals and honesty and justice and ethics. But all of these ideas and concepts are very much Western, right? So how do we start the conversation about justice and morals and honesty in a way that we don't impose these ideas of enlightenment in a way that we understand them? Mihir, can I start with you?
Wow, that's an overwhelming question, but that wouldn't stop me from responding. And I don't think justice or these are necessarily Western concepts. I think their definitions are often Western. In a sense, if we take justice, for example, we can almost go 3,000 years back and have descriptions of what justice would be. We can be a bit closer to Ashoka period and very well define what the justice would be after the Kalinga War, one of the largest humanitarian crisis to do that. So going back to my last but one point, which was about which I was calling mystical traditions, but it can be local traditions, it could be non-Western traditions, whatever label we want to use. But to sort of open up to that and let that come into our discussions, our understanding, our research, that is important. I don't think justice and some of the other things you said are necessarily Western. The way they are perceived are very Western. I've been recently doing some work on the Ottoman Empire and the separation that Suleiman the Magnificent did between Shariat and Qanun, the law and justice, and what the Shariat said. And then a fantastic opening of eyes at how the worldview can be so meaningful but so different as well. So yes, thank you.
Thank you so much, Mihir. Thank you. Would anyone like to follow up?
Yeah. May I?
Terry, please. Yes,
Okay.
of course. Oh, Jalali and then Terry. Yes, Jalali. Perfect.
Oh, go ahead, Terry.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
This is just maybe reflecting back to what JC was saying, and it's just an anecdote really that in the Views from the Frontline project you mentioned, the first iterations of that had questionnaires which were linked to the kind of priorities in the UNISDR Hyogo framework. So we were asking questions to people about a Western framework, disasters through a Western lens. Working with Ben Wisner, we said, this doesn't really doing what we intended to do, getting views from the front line. We redesigned the process. It became an open consultation with just 4 questions. What do you think are the greatest threats facing you? What are the consequences of them? What are the opportunities and what are the barriers? And we just got people to talk, and the data we gathered had to be analysed qualitatively, but it was listening to people's voices. We piloted this in an informal community on the edge of Tegucigalpa in Honduras, and talked to a couple of women who we talked through this process and went through it with. And we said, what do you think of this? And they said, well, it's really interesting because loads of people come and do surveys with us, UN agencies and all sorts of people. But this is the first time anybody's actually asked us what we think. And I think that's just a very sort of practical illustration of the tension between somehow shoehorning people's experience into a sort of construct, as opposed to actually hearing from people, what is the thing that's actually bothering you in terms of the pandemic? What we're hearing from people in West Africa, for example, is that often the government interventions are causing more harm than the pandemic itself. May or may not be true, but I just thought I'd shove that one in. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Jalali.
Okay. Thank you very much. I would like to come back to, when you say justice and morals are Western, I don't think so. Because if you said these 2 terms are Western, people will just go away. Where if you go back to history, all the culture, all the civilization, all the religions, they have justice, good justice. But the problem with the politician, with interest, like corruption, there is no civilization, no religion will tell you to go to corruption. Corruption is bad in all civilization, but the main problem we have is with politicians. They don't respect. They don't. It looks like they don't have ethics. These politicians everywhere. Look at them around the world. It looks like they are making all the harm to the people, according to our standards. Then I believe what we need, like Lori said, is like education. Maybe education from the beginning. Because if you have a good student with ethics and morals, when he will go to the professional world, he has the ethics, he has the moral. But if we start like now, we are trying to make gender. Everybody is talking about gender, and people think, really, they think this is Western. They said, oh, what they're doing? We have different culture. Oh, this is gender, this is Western culture. I believe if they speak about maybe better about human justice, human. I think, women are not other thing than human. And this will bring together people instead of saying gender. People are tired of gender, especially the UN. Even the UN play the game. I think somebody has to think out of the box, and like GC said about disasters, about this gender, about this justice, about human rights, because they are playing with them and they're making more harm than benefits. Even for disaster, politicians are playing, because like GC said, for whom we're going to make this post-disaster analysis? For whom? Just to publish? Or just for myself? Because if tomorrow I will find that the cause of the disaster, like, damage to building and people fatalities, is the responsibility of the administration because they implemented the buildings or the city on alluvions. That's their responsibility. If we say that, oh, this building should go, all of them, it's like a city. What is the solution? Then the government they won't let it go. They won't accept it because there is a lot of money and what to do. Or if you go, for example, to Algiers, which was built in the early 20th century, most of them, 50%. We know that these buildings, some of them, they don't have even foundation, and science was not good at that time. What to do with this building? We know that Algiers is in earthquake zone. What to do with it? And even politicians will tell the scientists what to do with this part of the capital. We should move it away. And this question, not only why we are doing this post-analysis. Of course, maybe we have to choose, or we have to work with politicians, we have to work with all stakeholders, let's say, to really make this post-disaster benefit to all of us, to the country as a whole. If not, I don't know why we're doing that. Because when you start collecting the data, some data belong to the government. And they said, the government said, oh, what are you going to do with this data? You have the responsibility. And that's, I think we have to think about it, how we approach all the stakeholders to help us in this big project. Thank you.
Thank you, Jalali. That's really important. JC?
Yes, I very much like Jalali's point about some of these, and I would go probably beyond concepts here, but in terms of values, and you refer to justice, but it could be for human rights as well. I think we need to be careful. I think it's not an issue about these things only being Western. If you look at human rights, for example, and if you look at human rights in Africa, for example, the Mandan Charter from the Mali Empire dates back to the 13th century, for example, and it clearly refers to droughts and hunger. And it's embedded within the charter. The point is that when we talk about human rights nowadays, it's from the European perspective and how one single tradition of human rights is being imposed upon the rest of the world. But there are other traditions that may be more appropriate in different contexts. And I think that takes us back to what's become to me the main paradox of disaster studies, is that we all agree now that disasters are social construct. I think no one would disagree with that, right? Disasters are social construct. But at the same time, we are rolling out and applying concepts and framework we take as universal all around the world. So how can we consider that one thing is a social construct and at the same time use the same concepts in very different social environments? I mean, that seems to me a sort of epistemological nonsense. And how do we get beyond that? How do we, and that's my question somehow, how do we open up spaces for local voices to be expressed in the first place, to be heard, to be listened to, in the context of these traditions of justice, human rights, and other cultural values and norms that matter locally, and acknowledging suffering, acknowledging harm. When I'm saying that disaster is an invention, I'm not saying that people are not suffering, people are not struggling, but it's a matter of recognizing what the struggle is in the first place, what the suffering is in the first place from an insider's perspective. So it's a kind of question for everyone. How do we open up that space? How do we listen to people on the ground? Mihir, yes, go ahead.
No, I'm glad you asked that, and that's something one has been struggling for quite some time, and I think there are sort of three areas which I don't know how to do it, but I think something needs to be done as far as post-disaster research is concerned. And one is the area of time, that how do we deal with time in post-disaster research? And my first point about, what is post-disaster, but not only that, going beyond that, when does a disaster end? And then it becomes a sort of post-disaster. That's sort of one part, but also there is second part that the experience of time during various stages of disaster or various stages of post-disaster, there are many stages, is different. And how do we, just account for that at least different experience of time, if not, take it sequential, then the time stopped. And so many times that is mentioned, but how do you actually represent that in research and finding and take it further? So one is our treatment of time in disaster research, perhaps is something I would think very important for me to work on. Second is clarity, and I don't know why this so much fussiness about things have to be clear, and when things are never clear, we know that, and we make them clear just to for our understanding, but things remain unclear. So, what do we do with that, especially in a disaster situation? How do you deal with this blurriness about things not being clear? And that's another area for me to look at far more carefully. And third is the area of labeling. That quickly you found something and it's a subcoding and coding and this is part of this and this. And of course it is important because how else will we capture it? But I think one needs to do it sort of tentatively and sort of find out more about it. That, is there a need for a label? And what if we didn't label it what it is? And just, let their sort of, as I said previously, fuzzy description be there. So those three areas, time and clarity and labeling. And in the end, where do we locate ourselves as a researcher or practitioner? And that becomes important. I think we end up sitting in the same seat and same location in the room, if there is a room and seats there. And can we relocate ourselves to gain a different perspective, to gain a different view of that? And that doesn't happen because there is so much of tyranny of what is your research, what does it build on, what does it take further, how does it relate with other ongoing research and all. And so the research which is supposed to open up the world actually keeps on closing and making narrower and narrower one feels. Thank you.
Thanks, Mihir. Yeah, actually, Sarah, I was going to bring you in here because I'm interested in your insights on working across different organizations and different groups, and obviously the power dynamics that are inherent to that. And it seems like a lot of up being done, or even beyond research, like community development, ends up being done to communities or for them in this kind of charity model. And they're kind of they become a consumer or a client. And so what does it look like to try to navigate those spaces and advocate for a model of doing work with people, or even standing back and not doing it and allowing them to do the work and maybe providing resources for them to do the work?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. That's great. I think from my experience and the literature, I tend to draw a lot from fields like environmental management, where they've done a lot more work in terms of managing different sectors and bringing people together. And I think I completely agree with Laurie in that one of the big problems is that researchers are trained to have their own interests and needs, and need to ask particular questions. And so I think the problem for me, in a way, comes down quite simply to the need to have a structure that tries to manage that, so that the local communities, but also depending on the country and the way that the disaster has unfolded and the way that people are trying to address it, that is always given priority over the sort of immediate research and need. Because I think what is interesting, if you're actually at the interface as we work in Canterbury, is that there was a really overwhelming pressure from researchers here after our February earthquake. And it was actually quite hard to get some researchers to hear that message. So it was difficult to get them to hear, well, communities need this. And you know, at the moment, we don't have a way to reach research communities or to manage research communities, I think. And communities in particular, in terms of grassroots communities in Christchurch, many of them really needed more research support than they were able to get. So my answer is more about, is more that it's actually always very difficult, and it really needs to be driven from the particular disaster. So rather than by researchers coming in from the outside, which is really what I think everyone has been saying, but you actually need a coordinating framework that explicitly allows research, gives research a place to participate and contribute, you know, in a formal way and in a transparent way. Because at the moment, research operates invisibly. So one of the things that happened after our Kaikoura earthquake, which was quite big but more rural in 2016, and followed on from the Canterbury earthquakes, was that there was a much more coordinated and transparent process used to involve particularly researchers. As Jalali says, I think there is a need. People, individuals in New Zealand needed, particularly engineers, to come and tell them if their house was safe or if it needed work. But what tended to happen was a sequence of engineers came through and provided data about the house to the government or to an insurance company or to our national insurance company. And to me, it's critical that in those situations, the data is regarded as belonging to the individual or the community that it is gathered from, and that it is given to them in the first instance. So I think that really, I don't think an international code stamped on people in any sort of detailed way is useful. But I think recognising that local communities, and including the social structures and the systems that are in place locally, that in many ways they should have the priority, and it is their disaster. They are the ones who are suffering from this, and they're the ones who are trying to recover. And I think the simple message really for the research community, I think, is to try to serve that rather than bring in some other interest to pursue. And I think I really like Terry's story about the 4 questions and the people who were surprised that they were being asked about their opinions, because I think I have a colleague who has collaborated with a friend in Africa, and they have a community there who were heavily researched about their water quality and the water supply and so on. And they'd had 4 different groups of UN researchers come in, and none of them had provided the locals with the information from the well that they had actually. So people were still drinking from this well. And so I think that can be a real problem. That it's always, I think, critical to remember that every disaster is completely different and should be defined actually by the community that has experienced the disaster rather than internationally or by those of us who come in. I don't know if that's very helpful actually, Jason, but it does seem to me to be very much something that appears to be a common thread around disasters.
This is wonderful, Sarah. Fantastic. Thank you so much. And unfortunately, I wish we could be talking for the rest of the day, evening. Thank you all so much for gifting us your time. It's been the most insightful conversation as always. I cannot thank you enough for everything that you do and for coming together today to discuss this with us. For the audience, thank you so much for joining us. I really hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as we did and you've learned as much as we did today. Please join us for the upcoming live streams over the summer. We've got a book group coming up. We've got another second special live stream that will be dedicated to the manifesto and our discussion of how we do research, who does research and where we do research. And later in the autumn, there are also a couple of more exciting kind of surprise live streams coming up. And please don't forget that our new season 5 is out on the 5th of July. So please follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, and join the podcast wherever it is you're finding your podcasts. So thank you so much and have a lovely rest of the day.
Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you all.